Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is the economic case for resilient solar plus storage in the Southeast. This webinar is being presented by Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project, and we have a number of excellent speakers on the line today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. That means that you can hear us, hopefully, but we cannot hear you. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using your computer's mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the webinar full screen, you can click on the little orange arrow that you see circled here, and that also works to expand your webinar console. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will be saving about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for a Q&A with the audience, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. We do expect to have a lot of questions because we have a lot of people registered today. So to make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end to type it in. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the webinar slides within about 48 hours, maybe even this afternoon. And we'll also be posting those webinar materials on our website at cleanegroup.org/webinars. That is a good URL to know because that is where upcoming webinars are listed, and it's also a good place to find all of our previous webinars. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Seth Mullendore. Seth is a project director and vice president here at Clean Energy Group, and he will be introducing our guest speakers and telling you a little bit more about Clean Energy Group and our webinar today.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks to everyone who's joining us for the webinar today. I'm really excited about this topic. So just a little bit of background about who we are here at the Clean Energy Group. We are a national nonprofit based in Vermont. We are completely foundation funded, and you'll see here a number of the foundations that support our work. We have a partner in the work that we're going to talk about today, the Resilient Power Project. That's the Meridian Institute, another nonprofit. We also have a sister organization, a nonprofit that's an organization of state organizations that manage clean energy funds. That's the Clean Energy State Alliance. So we work very closely with them as well. So we could go to the next slide. I'm going to tell you about the Resilient Power Project. So this work that we're going to talk about today was brought to you by the Resilient Power Project. This is a project we've had going for a number of years now. It really came in the wake of outages that hit the Northeast after Superstorm Sandy, and that event has been repeated again and again. In the last couple of years, the Southeast in particular got hit with a number of widespread outages due to hurricane activity. The goal of the project is really to increase access and availability of solar and energy storage technologies for resilient power, so for backup power, and also to bring the benefits of those technologies to disadvantaged communities. The project is really focused on bringing access to the technologies and the benefits of those technologies to low-income communities, communities of color across the country. We really have a focus on affordable housing and critical public facilities as far as our project work goes. And we also work a lot on the kind of the top-down approach, trying to get the right policies, incentives, supports, and programs in place at the federal, state, and local levels to increase access to the technologies and make them more accessible, particularly for disadvantaged communities. In that work, we do a lot of getting information out through webinars like this. We do a lot of reporting and analytical work like the Resilient Southeast report series that we're going to talk about today. All of that information, along with blogs and additional toolkits and mapping of energy storage and solar storage projects, are available at our project website at resilient-power.org, and there's a few of our reports down below. In our project level work, on the next slide, we here at Clean Energy Group, though we're not project developers or financiers, we do provide assistance to help facilitate the process of exploring and hopefully getting projects done. throughout the work. We've supported more than 100 project evaluations across the country. That's up over 150 now. These are just a few examples here. As you can see, a lot of our work has been focused on the Northeast and the West, but increasingly we're working with folks in the Southeast, in the Midwest, and the Southwest as well. So a lot of expansion in the work. So with that, I would like to introduce our speakers today. So I'm going to be starting things off. I'm going to give a brief overview of the work that we've done together with our partners across the Southeast, looking at the case for solar and storage. And I'm going to be joined by a couple of our partners. I'm very pleased to have them both with us today. First up is going to be Logan Burke. She's the Executive Director of Alliance for Affordable Energy, and they are based in New Orleans. Logan has been with the Alliance since 2013, and she's worked on a broad scope of consumer protection and energy issues, including energy efficiency, integrated resource planning, distributed energy resources, community solar, healthy housing, resilient energy systems like Solar+Storage, and any climate or energy-related policies at the City of New Orleans and the Louisiana Public Service Commission. She's a member of the New Orleans City Council's Environmental Advisory Committee, providing recommendations to all council members on sustainability policies for the city. And she's partnered on a number of publications on health, energy, housing, regulatory capture, reliability, resilience, and has given presentations at dozens of neighborhood associations, Rotary clubs, faith-based institutions, and schools on the intersection of energy, climate, economy, health in Louisiana. Before joining the Alliance, she was a founder and development director for the Committed to Equality Initiative in Los Angeles, California. And we also have with us Matt Cox. Matt is the Chief Executive Officer of the GreenLink Group, and GreenLink provided all the technical analysis that supports the findings that we present in our Southeast work. So they were a great partner in this work. And GreenLink Group also works with a lot of our other partners that we partnered on with this report and others across the Southeast on energy issues. So he's going to talk about a few of those intersections of that work. So Matt is the co-founder and CEO of the GreenLink Group, which is a clean energy research and consulting firm. He's the primary designer of several energy policy and technology models and has authored over 60 research publications on clean energy. Matt's policy recommendations have been adopted at every level of government, from the local to the international scale, and he has also been a primary architect and implementer of energy efficiency policies. Also with us today is my colleague, Marielle Robinson. She's a program associate here at Clean Energy Group and co-author on the Resilient Southeast reports, and did a lot of the work that I'm going to present here in a moment. So with that, I am going to introduce you to the work that we're going to talk about today. So Sam, I'll go up first. There we go. So we are going to talk about the Resilient Southeast report series that Clean Energy Group worked on with, as I said, a number of partners I'll introduce here in a minute. But wanted to just kind of give you an introduction to why we did this report, or what this report is. So really the fundamental question that we were trying to answer with this report series was, does solar paired with battery storage make economic sense for strengthening the resilience of cities throughout the Southeast? We were looking at clean energy technologies as a viable alternative to traditional backup power like diesel generators that have many issues with operation during emergency, as well as coming along with environmental issues. And unlike diesel generators, solar and storage has the potential to provide economic value throughout the year. So just a few metrics. We looked at 5 cities across the Southeast: Atlanta, Charleston, Miami, New Orleans, and Wilmington. Looked at 4 different building types in each of these cities. We looked at schools, nursing homes, multifamily housing, and fire stations. We explored 2 different technologies, solar PV and battery storage, both by themselves and together. And really, we came out with one result. This is overly simplified, but to answer our question, the answer was yes, that storage does make economic sense for resilience in the Southeast. Now, there's a lot of nuances to that, but that was the overarching finding that we had for this work. So, as I said, it wasn't just Clean Energy Group that worked on this. We worked with a number of different partners. These are our main partners. We also had a number of folks that weighed in and provided comments on the report series I don't have listed to here. But our primary partners, Greenlink Group and Alliance for Affordable Energy, that are both joining us today. Also Catalyst Miami, the Energy and Policy Institute, the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Southern Environmental Law Center, Southface, and Upstate Forever. Without these partners, we would not have been able to do this work, and they were very instrumental in making sure that this was done in the right way with local partners and regional experts. So the Resilience Southeast Report series, it covers a number of things. It's based on a detailed analytical analysis that the Greenlink Group did to determine the economic viability of solar and battery storage for these facilities in the Southeast. It also looked at a landscape review of the policy, regulatory, and market factors for solar and battery storage across the Southeast that really provided the background for the economics. So this is all based on what the landscape looks like in the Southeast for these technologies. And then offers up a set of recommendations, fairly general recommendations for policies and methods to advance resilient power in the Southeast, to advance these technologies. So why did we do this report series? Well, that was a pretty simple answer. Here are a number of hurricanes that have greatly impacted the Southeast. Recent events, Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Michael, Hurricane Irma, all in the last 2 years. Resulting in millions of outages across the Southeast. This does not list all of them, just some specific states for each of these that were impacted. And then going back a bit further, Hurricane Katrina, which was the most expensive natural disaster in U.S. history, and the great impact that it had on Louisiana. So we certainly saw this as a big problem, power outages, and the effect that they had, particularly on vulnerable communities across the Southeast. And that's the why of why we were doing this report series. So I'm going to focus a lot on the analysis part of the reports and those findings. So the methodology for how the analysis was done, there was really 3 parts to the analysis that we did with Greenlink. One is the economic scenario. So this looks at just looking at today, what prices are, what incentives there are, what the economic opportunity are, what would be the most cost-effective system to deploy on each of these buildings. Now, in some cases, that could be none. And so it turned out for different things. We're trying to maximize the net present value of installing the system. So anything that didn't provide savings over time was not considered viable under the economic scenario. Next, we looked at what we call the resilient scenario. And this, at a bare minimum, we had to have a system that was able to provide backup power through solar and battery storage to power critical loads for at least several hours during an outage. Now, critical loads didn't always mean an entire building. In some cases, it did, like a fire station. The whole building had to keep going. But in the case of, say, a school, we looked at how it would be used as an emergency center during an outage. So we thought of just a portion of the building, a gymnasium, auditorium, or cafeteria, and keeping loads going at that part of the facility, so not keeping the whole school going. So that the resilience scenario, regardless of economics, had to include energy storage and solar both. And then we looked at adding in, so the resilience scenario was just based off of, on one pass, the bill savings that could be achieved and any incentives that were available. So just looking at the economics of values that were easy to capture in today's environment, this is mainly bill savings by solar offsetting the cost, and in some cases, battery storage being able to manage the demand side for the building to reduce demand-related charges. We also looked at what would happen if we incorporated the savings that could be achieved by avoiding power outages. So this is the avoided outage cost. This is basically looking at the losses that would be incurred if a facility were to experience a power outage, which could be loss of providing services. In the case of critical community facilities, it could even mean, life-saving measures such as being able to provide medical care to folks, or being able to provide basic services to people that are residing and sheltering in place that may have medications that need refrigeration or medical devices that need charging. Certainly cell phones, so that they can keep in communication with folks and have clean water for water pumping. For the avoided outage costs, we used a methodology, or GreenLink used a methodology that was developed by the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab to value what the cost of those outages would be, and so what the value of avoiding them actually was. So this chart, there's a lot in here, but this is the main summary of the results from the economic analysis. So at the top line is looking at really the economic scenario. So that turned out to be, in most cases, it was solar alone was the most economic scenario. You can see for Charleston and Wilmington and Atlanta, solar made sense, was economically viable based on bill savings for all of the buildings we analyzed. Miami, some of the buildings those were the larger buildings based on the way that rates are structured and the economics of solar. It only made sense for schools and nursing homes. In New Orleans, because of mainly rate design there, the utility rates, solar actually did not make economic sense at this time for those buildings. The next case, solar paired with battery storage, this is looking at economics only for what the resilient scenario was. So you can see it's mixed results. So that Charleston and Wilmington both had 3 of the facilities. It made economic sense based on bill savings alone, and I'll get to this in a little more detail as we go through this. For Atlanta, half the buildings made sense. Miami and New Orleans, based just on bill savings, neither of the buildings didn't make sense to install the solar and energy storage, just based on savings versus cost over the life of the system. Now, when we incorporated the value of avoided outage costs, that additional value from being able to provide backup power and not have an outage incurred and incur those losses, turns out that solar and storage made economic sense across the board when you incorporated those avoided outage costs. This was a really big, important finding, and really gave a lot of precedence for incentives and programs that go into making sure these systems can be installed and offset that cost of the avoided outages, which is really hard to monetize these days, particularly for public communities, social services that buildings like these can provide. So as I said, all of these results are based on a landscape review. The most important factors into the economics of this is really the incentives, which in this case there was only solar incentives that were available, no storage incentives. The availability of net metering, and the potential for electric bill savings. So those first 3 columns were really the most important for directly impacting the economics of systems. And financing options and state and local and utility programs and policies, we're looking more at how is the market developed in each place, how many systems have actually been installed, and how has solar and storage progressed in that region. So as you can see here, there was a variety of results. Wilmington and Charleston, again, as you could see from the summary of results, they had the best kind of across the board for the landscape review, and turned out having the best economic results as well. The reports get into each of these in much more detail. I should say the report series itself, we have an overview document that goes into both of these kind of summary level charts. And then we have city-specific documents for each of the 5 cities that go in much more detail on each of these issues. And then we have a technical appendix for those that want to really dig into the weeds of how this was done. So I'm going to quickly walk through some of the high-level results for each of the cities. We ended up ranking them by the opportunity to deploy solar and storage in each location, and that's based off of the economic results. So on the left-hand side, you'll see some of the big takeaways for the opportunities and barriers in each place. And then on the right side, I'm just showing one of the results for one of the buildings. And we're going to look at secondary schools. So these are schools that would act as emergency shelters using solar and storage. So for Wilmington, the big factor, one of the big factors for why it ranked first in the opportunity for solar and storage deployment for resilient power was the fact that there is an incentive program through the utility serving Wilmington, Duke Energy Progress. They offer a solar incentive, and that really reduced the cost of the system by being able to tap into those incentives to bring down the cost of the system. So in the case of Wilmington, for the school, you can see the most economic result was to install a solar system. It has a pretty good payback of about 4.5 years. So this is a good result. When you incorporate battery storage, and this is a system you can see in the backup power, this will provide 12 hours, up to 12 hours of uninterrupted backup power, which could be extended based on a number of factors. And each day there's enough solar to recharge the batteries. You could again get up to 12 hours potentially of backup power. So this is not just 12 hours and you're done. When the solar system was paired with a 137 kilowatt hour battery system, you get that backup power. And while the cost of the system certainly goes up, and savings go up some to offset that, they don't completely offset the cost of the battery. So you end up with a lower net present value, and the simple payback period increases by about 2.5 years. But you can see that it's still an economic solution, not as economic as solar alone, but solar alone can't provide that resilience value. And so that's then, if you look just below in the kind of yellow highlighted area, that's bringing in that value of avoided outages costs. So the additional value of providing that backup power and avoiding the costs. It helps bring down the total cost of the project, improves the net present value, and brings down the payback period for the project. And it turns out with pretty good results. So Charleston really ranked a close second in our findings for the opportunities. And that, again, was based on something specific to South Carolina in this case, where they have a state tax incentive for solar that helped offset the cost and bring down the cost of the project. So again, if you look, solar turns out to be the most economic solution. On the top line there, a little bit lower as far as the net present value of the system, the savings over time, and the payback period is a little bit higher than it was for Wilmington, but still decent. It's 6 years. In the resilience scenario, again, you see that in the battery this time it could provide up to 13 hours of backup power with the same size battery system. Again, the economics get reduced a bit. So it takes almost 10 years for a payback, a simple payback on this, but you still get a positive value over the lifetime of the system. So it's a positive option, positive solution for the school to do this. If you incorporate, again, the avoided outages costs, it brings down the cost. Again, the simple payback period, which is an easy way to kind of compare the two scenarios, almost the same as just installing solar if you can capture that avoided outage cost value. So again, very good results for Charleston. Atlanta ended up being middle of the pack in our analysis results. They kind of had an interesting situation where they had very strong potential for economic savings, for bill savings, and based on just the way that the rate structures are in Atlanta from the utility that serves them customers there. But at the same time, Atlanta, they don't have what you would strictly think of as net metering. There is a solar buyback program that Georgia Power, the utility, provides, but it doesn't buy back that power, exported solar power, at the full retail rate. So it's quite a bit less than what you would be paying for electricity. So that impacted the economics, particularly for smaller buildings that weren't able to self-consume all of the solar. So they were exporting more energy to the grid, and that impacted the value. So as I showed in the summary results, the larger buildings like a school and nursing home, the economics still look pretty good in Atlanta, but for smaller loads, for smaller building types, it's a fire station and multifamily housing, it did not turn out as well for Atlanta. So again, solar turns out to be the most economic result for the school in Atlanta, having again around 7-year payback. In the resilience scenario, once again, this is a bit smaller solar system, a bit smaller battery. This is just based off of standard building sizes in the location in Atlanta. Provides up to 12 hours of backup power, and again, comes up with a positive economic results. This is still a good economic option, a little over 10-year payback period, and a positive savings over the life of the system. When you, again, incorporate those avoided outage costs, quite a dramatic result here in Atlanta, where it actually becomes a more economic solution to install solar and storage if you include that avoided outage cost than just doing solar alone. So if you can capture that resiliency value, it becomes the most economic option. You can see the highest net present value and a low payback period of just over 4 years. Things got less good when we were looking at Miami. Miami had some things going for it, but the biggest barrier for Miami and in New Orleans were just a lack of potential for electric bill savings based on how electricity customers are charged based on their energy charges. So solar did turn out to be a positive economic investment, but we've got a payback period of about 12 years here, pretty low net present value. So it is the best option for the school to save money to put solar on, but it's not necessarily kind of knock it out of the park. This is an obvious solution. You'll see in the resilience scenario, actually, it installs more solar on the school, the maximum amount that it could. Did not choose to do that for the most economic solution. Pair that with battery storage. When you don't incorporate the value of resilience, you see you get a negative net present value. So it means it would not be an economic option to do that without incorporating the value of resilience. Value of resilience very much dramatically changes the economics here for Miami, bringing the payback period to less than 3 years. This has a lot to do with the cost of outages, the avoided outage cost. It's quite high for Miami because of the outages they experienced from Hurricane Irma. So the value of avoiding those outages is quite high in Miami, higher than the other locations. Just quickly on to New Orleans. New Orleans is the only case where we didn't find that solar made economic sense based on bill savings alone. Again, this is just due to how rate structures are devised, the rate tariffs look in New Orleans. The resilience scenario, adding a battery to solar that wasn't economic did not help the economics. It's a very terrible payback period of 33 years. However, when you bring in the value of avoiding outage costs, you once again come to a positive net present value and a payback period of just about 11 years, a little under 11 years. So it becomes an economically viable solution. And we found this in the end for all the buildings that we looked at across all locations, even if solar didn't make sense, as in the case for a few of the buildings. So I'm not going to get too deep into the recommendations. We lay these all out in the reports. But just quickly here before I turn it over to our partners, some of the recommendations was incentivizing demonstration projects, to get people familiar with the technologies and prove it out for each location. Establishing technical assistance funding. A lot of these projects never get explored because there's just not funding to take that first step before even thinking about developing a project. So that's a lot of the work that we do here at Clean Energy Group, trying to bridge that gap. Of course, incentives are always helpful for helping bring that cost down, particularly incentives for battery storage, which is still a new and emerging technology. Energy storage procurement targets, as has been done with renewable portfolio standards. Having targets can incentivize more market development and bring down the cost in that market. Also creating market opportunities for storage to provide things like grid services. This could be demand response services or frequency regulation. I'm not going to get too geeked out on that, but these are market opportunities that are providing revenue streams for storage in other areas of the country that are making storage more economically viable. There's also a new emerging push. Massachusetts just became the first state to include energy storage as a cost-effective measure in its state energy efficiency programs. So for states that don't have additional money for incentives, something to consider is tapping into efficiency funds by including energy storage as a demand management measure for an efficiency. Throughout the states that we looked at in the Southeast, there's $460 million available in and energy efficiency funds. Also including resilient power, solar and storage, and disaster relief funding. Puerto Rico is implementing almost $50 million incentive program through their community development block grant disaster relief funds, and it's something that other impacted states and regions can look into. So with that, I am going to stop my presentation and turn things over to Logan Burke to talk about things that she's working on in New Orleans and Louisiana.
Thank you so much, Seth. This is Logan. I've been really honored to work on this project. And as you can see, especially in New Orleans, there's a lot of work to do to make sure that we're making our energy systems more resilient. I just want to talk for a second about the regulatory landscape in Louisiana. It's pretty unusual. From what we have gathered, it is unique in that New Orleans is the only city council in the country that regulates an investor-owned utility. The closest thing we have to a similar situation would be Washington, D.C., although it's not the council there, it's its own regulatory body. But the reason I bring this up is that it means that New Orleans has been more progressive in our energy policies than the Louisiana Public Service Commission has been always. But what this has meant is that, for example, and I'm going to get to net metering in just a minute, we have a full retail net metering here in New Orleans. New solar customers at the state level do not enjoy full retail net metering. The interesting thing that is a bonus of having that regulatory authority is that our policies can be layered in a way to move us in the right direction. And what I mean by that is the City of New Orleans has been a member of the 100 Resilient Cities international program. We have both a resilience and a climate action strategy. Largely, resilience in New Orleans has meant managing water, but increasingly we're recognizing it includes energy. And so there's overlap in our resilience work and our climate action work now. Entergy New Orleans is a vertically integrated investor-owned utility and has served the City of New Orleans for many decades. I'll say it that way. While the rest of the state is largely Entergy Louisiana. I wanted to start us with an image from a recent meeting here in New Orleans. This is one of the reasons there's actually sort of extra value in what we're seeing from the community is asking for cleaner energy resources that they can own themselves. There was a recent fight you might have heard about in some news articles over a new peaking gas plant in New Orleans. Unfortunately, that gas plant so far still has the authority to move forward, despite an awful lot of folks you can see in this image in City Council chambers asking for the council to shut down or to not allow a new gas peaking power plant. The reason this is such an interesting photo is it's largely residents of an eastern part of New Orleans where there's an enormous penetration of solar net metering. I also want to show you why we think it's so important that New Orleans has a resilient energy strategy. As you can see in this map, we are surrounded by water. We've got obviously the Mississippi River. Just over to our east and south is the Gulf of Mexico, and the Lake Pontchartrain is just north of us. And so we believe it's really important that we have energy that is available right here in New Orleans and is available on our distribution system. And then just for some context, I wanted to show you really where the water actually is. Anywhere that doesn't look like there are large buildings built there, it's actually wetlands or straight water. It just really gives you a sense of how vulnerable the city of New Orleans is. But we have a ton of solar already in the city. It's interesting, despite the fact that we haven't had much in the way of solar coming from our utility thus far, the residents and businesses in the city of New Orleans have installed over 40 megawatts of solar in the last decade. This is an image actually from just one company's installations from last February. I'm not saying they did it all in 1 month. I'm saying this is their accumulated installations up until February of last year. And the point that I'm trying to make here is, while indeed our commercial customers, those large customers like schools or multifamily buildings thus far, haven't had the opportunities or the cost-effective buy-in opportunities for solar, lots of residents have been saving money with solar because we have that full retail net metering. And because there was, for quite some time, a pretty valuable incentive that brought down the cost on top of the federal 30% reduction or 30% tax credit. There was an additional statewide 50% tax credit on the cost of installation, which really drove installations across the state. New Orleans is a solar city, and we have been looking at ways to bring back something like an incentive, although that wouldn't have to be nearly as rich as the incentive that was offered at the state level for all those years. Let's see. We also have an awful lot of solar already on low to moderate income housing, and that's largely because we also have enabled leasing, meaning customers who would not generally be able to buy outright or finance even outright solar installation on their home. Leasing companies in our state have been able to support those families installing solar. Entergy is starting to add some solar, but it's largely it is largely not installed yet. So far, we've got 1 megawatt of Solar+Storage, but we haven't seen much reporting about it. Entergy did this as a pilot project back in 2016, and it's up and running out in New Orleans East. But as you can see, it was pretty expensive for what we got. And again, there hasn't been much transparency yet about the resilience benefits that Entergy has been getting on the distribution system as a result. Entergy is currently installing 5 megawatts of distributed commercial scale rooftop, but that is acquired and then built out by Entergy themselves, and will be all in front of the meter. None of that would be behind the meter. And then finally, looking toward a 3-project portfolio of large utility scale that would be, for the most part, not in Orleans Parish, but some of it, about 20 megawatts, would be in Orleans Parish. So currently, part of the problem that we've been having is, aside from not having an incentive or a rate structure that would really drive solar adoption in the city, we're working through an integrated resource plan, and it's all about incremental capacity additions, but it is sort of agnostic to siting. It's agnostic in terms of resilience and sort of valuing that resilience, and largely because so far we've been told that the utility has been unable to measure or value that distribution planning or distributed Solar+Storage. And so in this current round of integrated resource planning and in the past one, unfortunately, it means that we're only really seeing a part of the picture when we're looking at what should be integrated resource planning. Also, already, our reliability is pretty subpar. The utility is going through a prudence review because we have had so many outages and increasing outages over the last 6 years. So there is really a need, frankly, not just in the face of your everyday or your major event days and those major storms, but in the sort of regular outage issues that we're dealing with here in New Orleans already. There is in the IRP rules a section that after the modeling is complete, the utility is expected to score and rank the various potential portfolios among a number of metrics that wouldn't add to the capacity planning sort of modeling scenarios, but then give the council a better understanding of the how those portfolios will perform in different real-world scenarios. Unfortunately, right now that scorecard again doesn't rank, doesn't include resilience as a metric, and so that's just sort of another roadblock that we're hoping to get over in the next round of integrated resource planning. I'm trying to advance my slide.
If you click on it, it should work.
Okay. Is it possible for you to advance my slide? There we go. Thank you. So some policies that we're all working on here right now that we think will be important in relation to adding more of this solar+storage in New Orleans and incentivizing it. We have gotten community solar rules enabled just a couple of months ago. We're hoping that that as those community solar projects are developed out, that they will also start to include storage as well. We are underway in this integrated resource plan through this fall. We're also working on a renewable portfolio standard here in New Orleans, and we're hoping that this renewable portfolio standard isn't just renewable, but it is resilient. And we're really encouraging folks who are engaging in this to think about not just the renewable bona fides, but also the value and importance of resilience as we're putting together what our energy system looks like. I mentioned that there is a prudence review underway to deal with the regular sunny day outages that we're experiencing in New Orleans, and we're expecting for that to wrap up. And then, of course, one of the big issues that we're dealing with is the rate case. We know that in New Orleans, it's one of those reasons that that our city didn't, the modeling didn't show right now that commercial buildings make the economic case. That is largely because of those rate structures, and we're hoping to resolve some of that in this rate case. I believe that is my final slide, and I'm excited to hand it off to Matt.
Okay, great. Let's see if I can go back one. Wonderful. It's a pleasure to be with everybody today. I'm going to be as brief as possible, but talk about some of the activities that we've seen now across the Southeast, primarily focused on the utility and the local scale. So at the utility level, we actually have had a whole lot of activity going on at the integrated resource plan stage. So since the Southeast is still generally a regulated monopoly type of system, we go through these regular planning processes like Logan just mentioned was going on in New Orleans and in Louisiana. This year alone, we've had the Duke Carolinas IRPs were Duke Carolinas and Duke Progress both released theirs at the end of 2018. All the hearings have been going on this year. TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, put theirs out in January, as did Georgia Power. And Dominion was going through their debates in Virginia at the end of last year, and their commission told them to go back and do it over. And so they're in that process right now. all of those utilities included some amount of storage as part of their integrated resource plans. And so what we're seeing there is a lot of different assumptions and plans and approaches towards storage specifically, but also about how it can be paired with solar. So what kind of capacity value do the utilities believe they're going to see? What kind of experimentation are they trying to do? We've got pilots that have been proposed that would be up to $250 million expenditures in the space by these utilities, just so that they can begin to understand the behaviors and the way that these solar or solar plus storage projects, or storage all by itself, will interface with their systems. So there's quite a bit moving at that point. And then of course there's the tax credit implications, where if the storage is paired with solar, then they're able to take advantage of the investment tax credit that's currently offered by the federal government. So we've heard a lot lately about uncertainty around those tax credits, around whether there's going to be an extension for the existing solar tax credit, whether there will be the creation of one that is just for storage all on its own, since there are bills for both of those things moving their way through Congress right now. And then of course you have concerns about cost and reliability, how long, in particular with storage, how long will those systems last? What's kind of the daily wear and tear? And then all of that, I think it'd be fair to say, is applying both to the utility scale application and to the customer-sided conversation. What would this mean as you see more and more of these systems deployed? How is that going to impact the entire electricity grid? And what should that mean for these utilities resource plans? When they move down a step from the integrated resource plan and they move towards actual procurement, you see these debates around how they should treat things from the RFP perspective. So are we looking at all source RFPs? That's what most of the advocates are pushing for at this point, is to try to make sure that these are not just natural gas RFPs. But trying to make sure, again, that capacity value question comes up. If we have solar paired with storage, how much does that increase the total availability and dispatchability? And are you going to have the ability to call on that if it's customer-sided? What kind of arrangements and contract language need to be created? Then you also have a question about value. Most of our regulated monopolies do not provide locational marginal pricing like you would see in a deregulated market. So then you get into a question of avoided cost and how it should be calculated and provided to the customers here. And then we have seen the value of lost load, as was mentioned as a resilience benefit, has also come up as it relates to how these systems can assist with the overall reserve margins for the utilities, making sure that they're still able to provide power reliably and consistently at a low cost to all of their customers. Locally, at the city level, we've seen plenty of activity underway. As Logan was mentioning, New Orleans is one of the resilient cities. Atlanta is also one of the resilient cities. And so we've started to see some messaging come along that there's this real emphasis on, during outages, having the ability to establish these resilience hubs so that you can provide services to the community, especially in the Southeast, where we're looking at urban heat islands becoming more extreme, the hot weather events becoming more extreme over time. The ability to provide cooling services in particular is one that's of interest, so that you don't have, especially the elderly, being exposed to unsafe conditions. So the ability to also provide those emergency services and communication hotspots is also another critical portion of that, so that people can come and make use of the ability to have access to power to make sure that they can still communicate with their loved ones, but also with the broader community as a whole. When we're looking at some of these Atlanta-specific details, you also have the city of Atlanta has 25 municipal solar installations that are underway. And so those have to date provided over $30,000 in utility bill savings since 2018, since the first one was put in place. And there are a couple of fire stations. We mentioned in the report the economics looking favorably for fire stations in Atlanta. We now have 2 fire stations that have Solar+Storage projects that are getting underway, so that those will actually be able to serve as resilient hubs in those communities. And with that, I will turn it back over. So thank you.
Okay, great. I think we can start up with the questions. Thanks for the presentations, everyone. They were great. We actually had a lot come in, so I'm going to get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes, but I encourage everyone who asked a lot of very technical questions to take a look at our technical appendix for some answer to those, but we'll get through as many as we can. And one of the questions that came up a lot was, in the event that there is a hurricane or a natural disaster, how do solar panels and battery storage stay protected through that? Do they have to be removed? Is there an encasing that happens? How can critical facilities ensure that they're safe through a storm? So I don't know if Seth or Matt, you want to take that.
I can give a short answer, and then Seth, if you want to build on top of that, feel free. We've had some experience with that in Georgia, where we've had the hurricanes strike. Generally, they're installed and ballasted in such a way that you don't see that that issue really negatively affect them. They were prepared for that, and we've gone back and done studies to see how they survived that kind of hurricane damage, the hurricane strength winds, on some of the barrier islands in Georgia, and they've come through with flying colors so far. So I think as long as the systems are built to withstand those winds, and we know how to do the engineering to do that, we've seen that come through successfully, fortunately.
Yeah, and I would just echo what Matt was saying there. I think making sure that those specifications are put into the design up front, and making sure you're dealing with folks that know how to design a system to meet those hurricane wind standards. Of course, battery storage should be installed in a location that's not going to be flood prone if you're worried about flooding being an issue. So making sure all those factors are defined up front, there should be no problem with the system being able to weather pretty extreme circumstances.
Great. And then another question that came up quite a bit was what battery chemistry was used and why was that particular battery selected?
Yeah, I'll field this first, and Matt, please feel free to jump in. So this was looking at lithium ion. These were based off of LG Chem batteries as far as the specifications for the battery sizing that was used. Lithium ion was used because the majority of battery installations that are going in right now are lithium ion batteries. Now, for resiliency applications, lead acid are still a popular choice. The varieties of those that are still used quite a bit. But we wanted to look at batteries that would be able to be cycled often, which lithium ion does better with, so that they could be used for daily savings for things like managing demand. So that's why the batteries were used and why lithium ion was considered. Matt, if you have anything to add to that.
I think you said it great.
Great. Logan, you had mentioned in your presentation that there were planning problems that exist in New Orleans. What would you consider what the major planning problems are? And then along with that, talking about community solar rules and the opportunities there, were you speaking specifically to New Orleans, or was it to the state of Louisiana in general?
Sure. So I'll take that one at a time. So one, I think, of the biggest planning concerns that we have had is that rather than integrated resource planning that is building toward a system that works in the way we use it, which is to say, takes into account where resources are sited, right? Whether they are within the system, within a load pocket, within the city on the distribution system, or somewhere else. None of that is taken into account, and so it makes it difficult to say when the modeling is being done on what is, quote, needed, right? If the IRP is intended to develop, portfolios for what is needed, it's not really answering that full question. And so that makes it difficult then, unless you really start to think about using storage again, and Solar+Storage as part of a demand-side management piece of your portfolio. And right now, storage is not included, at least in New Orleans IRP, on the demand-side management side of the sort of column. The other thing that is sort of difficult in terms of planning is that in New Orleans, we are currently working through a docket that would create something like a request for proposal rule. We're in a rulemaking. We've never had such a thing in New Orleans. A lot of Matt talked a little bit about competitive or all-source solicitation. Right now, there's no requirement at all for how the utility in New Orleans conducts its resource acquisition. And so that means that there's very little transparency, and it has meant that, especially in this most recent case with this peaking gas plant, nothing else got a chance to really compete. It was the regulator effectively had to take the utility's word on faith that there was one solution for the city's needs. When it comes to the community solar piece of the question, those rules apply only to New Orleans. We are hoping to get something in place at the state level for community solar so that people can have more ownership. Because, again, as most of the Southeast is, it's all vertically integrated and monopoly utilities. And so there's very little opportunity for folks to pick outside of rooftop solar. It's hard for folks to have a say in where their energy is coming from or what kind of energy that is. So right now, those rules will only apply in New Orleans. And we're still working through the final pieces on consumer protections to make sure that that as community solar is rolled out, that there are guardrails in place. I hope that answers the two questions.
Great, yeah, thanks. And Matt, regarding your slide about the municipal installations in Atlanta, do all 25 or a portion of those 25 include storage, or is it just the 2 fire station projects that are underway? And if storage isn't being utilized, do you have any insight as to why that might be? Is it economic driven?
Yeah, so right now it's just the 2 fire stations. I think the reason for that is just kind of phasing in the way that the project itself was designed. So that project began in 2015. It took several years to get all the contract language in place, but the contract is flexible enough that we should be able to bring storage in the future here. But it'll be a conversation with those developers to see if the economics make sense for those individual properties as they go forward. So right now, the fire stations are what the city has secured funding to do, but there's certainly more conversations about trying to expand that beyond just those 2. The city views that as one of their core activities as a part of their resilient city strategy.
Great, thanks. We are coming up on 2 o'clock here. We'll take a couple more questions, but for our panelists that have to head out right at 2, thank you so much for participating. Okay, so another question that we have is if the analysis included maintenance costs for solar and storage systems throughout their life in terms of their O&M, or was that not considered?
Yeah, so that was looking at the total system and cost, the installed cost. It didn't so much factor into the O&M, which tends to be fairly minimal for solar and storage systems. What it did take into account was these were done over a 25-year lifespan, which is the estimated lifetime of the solar system. Now, the energy storage side of that and the inverter are not expected to last that long, so it did include the replacement costs for the battery and inverter at after year 15. So those would be the main kind of expense of the system over time. The actual operation and maintenance do add some costs, but they're pretty minimal in the economic considerations.
Okay, great. Another question that we got was regarding how the avoided cost was compiled and how many hours was considered to be resilient. So was there a certain number of hours that the system needed to meet in order to be considered a usable system, or was it just what was calculated?
Yeah, so as far as what qualified as a resilient system, the lowest amount of hours that we considered in this, or that any of the systems had, I believe was 6 hours, and that was for a nursing home. Nursing homes tended to have on the lower side because they had not as much space for solar, so that limited some of the ability to provide resilient power. And then they had high energy demands just because of the medical devices used in nursing homes. So 6 hours was really the minimum. As far as the resilience benefit and the number of hours, so the technical appendix really gets into the weeds on how that was calculated, but basically it looked at what was the maximum amount that the solar and storage system could provide during hurricane season. So we consider that the most likely time for an outage, and used that maximum amount as the avoided outage cost. So really, the system could provide more value than that throughout the year for multiple value outages, but we just considered the one kind of major event and what would it be able to do in one instance for the avoided outage cost. But yeah, please do look at the technical appendix and reach out if you have any questions about that, either to me or to Matt.
Okay, great. I think that was a lot of our questions. We also had quite a few questions regarding with the increase of air conditioning as a critical service, whether it's in Louisiana or other parts in the Southeast. How realistic is that was it included in places like for the nursing home? And how does battery storage, is it the most efficient option compared to other energy storage options if you want to cover air conditioning?
Yeah, well, like a lot of things, that really depends. So when we looked at the critical loads for the buildings, what we did was we scaled down from what the expected operational load profile would be for the building. So how the building would normally be operated, including air conditioning in the cases where that made sense, which would include all of the buildings during the summer months in the Southeast. So that was factored into the analysis. Energy storage and solar certainly can support air conditioning. It is a bigger load though, a higher power load. So it does factor into the sizing of the system and how big a system you're going to be supporting. Now, whether or not solar storage is the most viable and economic for air conditioning, it really just depends. There also have been installed hybrid systems that include some sort of traditional generator along with solar and storage to be able to make sure you have enough power for some of those higher loads, any places where you have pumping and things like that. There may need to be other considerations, but it's really on a case-by-case circumstance.
Okay, great. I think that concludes the portion of our questions that we have for today. Thanks everyone for participating. I'm going to hand it over to Sam in case there's any last minute additions that we have.
Thanks, Mari and Seth and Logan and Matt for all of your presentations and for this webinar. For everyone on the line, thank you for attending. We will be sending you a copy of the slides and the webinar recording via email. You should get that in the next 24 hours or so. If you'd like to find more resources from the Resilient Power Project, we encourage you to visit our website, resilient-power.org. That's a place where you can find information about upcoming webinars, the report we discussed today, all kinds of other resources. We're also on Facebook and Twitter for more frequent updates from us. So thank you very much, everyone. We hope to see you at the next webinar.